to Pocketables Weekly News Roundup number 6. This week has been quite a doozy. We have things going on absolutely everywhere. With that said, let's jump into some of the simpler things before we move on to things that are going to have more reaching and lasting impacts. So we've been talking about the RTX 3080 for a couple of weeks, and the 3000 series as a whole. The benchmark numbers were released on Monday, and to put it bluntly, at $699 the RTX 3080 is a beast. I've watched a couple of different sites, and most of the benchmarks relative to its immediate predecessor, the 2080, we're seeing between a 70 and 90% uplift. There's a couple of standout cases where we actually do get a twofold increase in performance. And these were used by Nvidia's marketing numbers, up to 2x performance increase. And there's a few that don't quite reach that high that are held back by some other constraint. Typically CPU-bound applications at this point, where there's just so much graphics hardware there the CPU can't keep up. So the 3080 is a monster at $699. It makes the 2080 look bad, the 2080 Super, and the 2080 Ti all pale in comparison, although there are a few places where those cards still have their uses, especially the 2080 Ti with its additional memory capacity compared to the 2080. Is going to continue to be favored by people using them for things like AI training that just doesn't fit in the memory footprint of the newer card. That said, there'll be a 3090 that I'm sure will appeal to those users, and the 3070 is going to come in with even less memory, but still, if what we saw in the 3080 holds true, has the potential to outperform both the 2080 and the 2080 Ti for everything shy of things that really do need the bigger frame buffer. That said, at $699 it's a steal, and to follow that up, when orders went live on Tuesday, if you blinked you missed them. Currently, I've heard numbers that there was more traffic than Black Friday morning trying to get those out of sites like Newegg. I've heard that bots were responsible for a large number of the orders, unfortunately. So hopefully this gets sorted out. Nvidia has made statements that they are manually reviewing individual orders to try and track down and sniff out bots that would have made these cards unobtainable for the rest of us. That said, they are making more cards. They said they're making more as quickly as they can to get them to retailers. They want to sell these, and rightly so. It's a excellent looking piece of hardware, and everyone seems to want to get their hands on one. Don't go spend $80,000. Don't go spend $80,000 on one that's been jacked up not only by the bots from the scalpers trying to sell these cards at a markup to basically just filter money out of things. But also, people have resorted to making counterbots that generate things like fake eBay accounts and put in absurdly high bids to just drive these prices ridiculously high so that scalpers are stuck footing the bill and sitting on the card they tried to buy and sell and flip. So, this is all making for interesting entertainment, at least. Some more hardware news. Tiger Lake preview systems have shipped to various news outlets, and the reason I say these are preview systems and not review systems is that these are Intel's hardware development kit. So it's shipping with a fully functional laptop-like device and has a top-tier Tiger Lake, what do they got on the 1185 G7, but it's not something that you'd go buy from Dell, Lenovo, or Hewlett Packard, and it doesn't have some of the power optimization and battery optimization and acoustical tuning that would go with those. So it just has this Tiger Lake chip with a heatsink that'll keep it cool at its maximum thermal output, and therefore isn't quite representative of what we'll see in the market. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, Intel's playing things fast and loose with the whole TDP thing and allowing the processor to have a vendor-defined TDP. I don't really like this approach because it does mean that I can't guarantee that 3 laptops with an 1185 G7 will all perform the same if one system is set to 12 watts, and the next is set to 15, and then the third is set to 28. The one with a 28 watt headroom is going to perform better. Intel used to only have one TDP per line of chips, so you'd buy a U series chip and it was a 15 watt chip, and you'd buy a Y series chip and those were 7.5, or you'd get an H, and I think H might be the only one that had 2 different TDPs typically, but it was different TDPs on different parts. So H, parts this and below were 35 watt parts, and this and above were 45 watt parts. Intel kind of threw that all out with these dual TDP options for the U series chips, and I believe they're going to carry it through with the Y series chips as well, having multiple TDP options. So that's definitely going to make things confusing when you can have a handful of systems running the same chip all perform wildly different. That said, the results I've seen so far, some of the outlets have made sure to test this chip at multiple TDP points. And what we're seeing is good. We have good CPU performance. We don't have a massive increase, which is kind of to be expected. So this is a new process. It's the 10 nanometer SuperFin process. And it's the same architecture. So Intel previously has not launched a new architecture on a new process in quite some time, and they're continuing with that, where in order to get the process optimized and figured out, we're still on some revision of the Skylake architecture. So our per clock performance has gone up. We've seen things like tweaks to the cache arrangement and other stuff. But for the most part, if you were happy with what you were seeing on a 9th or a 10th gen chip, you're going to see more of the same on these 11th gen chips, at least on the CPU side. And that's not great, but it's not terrible either. So there's no room for regression, really. The bigger stories on the graphics side. Tiger Lake chips, at least the G7 variants, are shipping with a 96 execution unit Z graphics core. This is actually fairly impressive. There's a couple of benchmarks I've seen. There'll be a link to the article with them, where it's doing pretty competitively, at least as far as offering performance for esports titles are concerned. So that puts these G7 chips in a place where laptops that previously would have been equipped with lower end or mid-tier graphics cards, so from Nvidia's side that would be like a 1650 or a 1030, that class of cards aren't going to make a whole lot more sense, at least this year. And when I say at least this year, right now, the 1650, the 1050, there are no 3000 series cards that are replacing those yet. There are no 3000 series cards that are replacing those yet, and without cards that slot in above the Z graphics as far as performance is concerned, there's going to be a very small market where you want a dedicated graphics card that performs equal to or worse than your integrated graphics. That's not to say that there's no market for such a thing. There are still things that AMD and Nvidia's graphics are going to do better, especially when it comes to things like professional applications or anything that can leverage things like CUDA. But as I mentioned before, esports titles and that type of thing, these new graphics cards really do have a chance to adjust how that market sees the need for a dedicated card. The only thing that I'll caution that with is that Intel isn't shipping the 96-core G7 on the lower end chips that would normally be considered for things like gaming cafes in some of these LAN box systems. We're not seeing an i3 paired with a 96 execution unit chip. We're seeing it paired with a 40 execution unit chip. Now there is a middle ground here. There's an i5 that's coming with a G7, but it's been cut down to 80 execution units. That may be a winning combination to offer a budget laptop with good graphical performance that doesn't require a dedicated card. It remains to be seen if anyone opts to make such a thing, and it may simply be that we do see, 1050s, some of the lower end MX chips, 1650s just fade away. That said, I do think at least the desktop 1650, which we covered a couple of weeks ago, is going to stay around for a while. On the desktop side, having a full 75 watts to dedicate to the graphics chip is a night and day difference compared to what you would do in a laptop. So some troubling news. Gaming behemoth Razer had suffered a data leak this week, releasing nearly 100,000 customers' information on a misconfigured Elasticsearch AWS system. So this is problematic for a couple of reasons. Number one, the sheer volume of data that was leaked is not just customers' names, it's their whole stack of information shy of the credit card. So if you purchased something, your name, your address, your email, your phone number are included in this leak. And that's not good. That's not good data security. The other problem here is that Razer really likes their cloud-based software. You need an account to do almost anything with most of their systems. I believe they've eased up on that a little recently, but it's still very much encouraged that if you want to change the RGB colors on your mouse or change the sensor DPI, you need to sign in with an online account, which is bad software design from my point of view. But once again, your data potentially could have been leaked here. So they did have an email address. It is dpo@razer.com. That'll be on the bottom of the screen here. I'll have a link to it. You can email if you have questions or comments about your data. There'll be a link to an article with more information about the data breach. Hopefully, this number one gets Razer to shape up a little bit on the security side. Number two, discourages further use of cloud-based logins for things that don't really need it. Speaking of mistakes this week, Customs goofed. They grabbed nearly 200,000 OnePlus buds, mistaking them for counterfeit Apple AirPods. So they don't really look the same. I mean, they look similar, but they're not at all packaged the same. They say OnePlus all over them. And it should be fairly clear that these aren't actually a fake product, since other federal databases, the FCC is going to have a registration for them. It's very easy to look them up on OnePlus's website and see that they don't claim to be AirPods at all. And then they went to put out a press release like they were big heroes that stopped some counterfeit merchandise from coming in. So Customs has a bit of egg on their face this week. Hopefully they get those released soon, but if you're waiting for your OnePlus earbuds to show up and they've been delayed, I think Customs has them right now. Hopefully they get that sorted out soon. On the Apple side of the world, iOS 14 was announced this week, and I believe released a day after the announcement, which is record time between announcing that it exists and is coming and just letting it all out. There were a couple of hardware announcements alongside this. one of which is kind of disappointing, and the rest are par for the course and actually kind of encouraging. So we got a new iPad Air, and the new iPad Air is shipping with some of Apple's new CPU, which is interesting on its own. But the iPad Air now packs a USB Type-C port. This is another step towards getting rid of that proprietary Lightning connector that you actually can't connect a MacBook out of the box with one of these iDevices, because they don't ship with a USB-C to Lightning cable. They ship with a regular USB to Lightning. So you'd need an adapter. So we do have the new iPad Air shipping with the USB-C cable, which is good. We encourage that. The new iPad also launched this week. Feels like a step backwards after looking at the iPad Air. We're getting an older A12 SoC. We are still getting a Lightning connector here. One bit of good news that I've heard is that it is shipping with a USB-C to Lightning adapter, which is going to mean faster charging, and potentially you actually could plug it into your MacBook now. That's actually a step in the right direction, at least shipping that cable as opposed to the older style cable. There's also a new Apple Watch with plenty of features included in it. None of them stood out as necessarily groundbreaking, as we've seen in previous years where we had things like an EKG added. This feels more like a refinement of the design, which isn't a bad thing. I've seen some notes that Force Touch has been removed. I don't actually have an Apple Watch to comment on that very well, so I'm going to leave a link to the Macworld article that I skimmed through this and allow them to explain what's new and what's good and what's bad better than I can. Potentially with these releases, we will have new iPhones coming soon. There's been plenty of leaks and rumors for the past few months about this year's iPhone. We don't have any real concrete data on that yet, so we'll update you when we have something. More on the software side, Vivaldi browser is now shipping with a optional bottom tab item for Android. Now, I probably haven't mentioned this before, and maybe I'll write an article about this. I dumped Chrome, Google's Chrome, completely years ago on the PC, and about a year ago at this point, the second Vivaldi launched for Android. I feel like I get better privacy, it feels more secure, and it definitely feels snappier, and to top it all off, it's far more customizable than Chrome. I can do things like vertical tabs on the left-hand side on the PC, so seeing more of these customizations migrate their way to the Android side of the world, which is different, and there's been less options just due to what can and can't be done on a phone, is good. This is encouraging, and this is the right type of thing we want to see. I think putting the tabs on the bottom, it's on my list to try this week, is definitely going to be an interesting thing. So I will potentially have an article about that next week if I love it or hate it. But there'll be a link to the Vivaldi blog talking about that and a few other customization tweaks they've added recently. But that's the big headline one, is that you can put your tabs on the bottom now, which should make for easier navigation on all these tall phones. Sony appears to have felt a little bit of pressure from Microsoft this week, announcing the PS5 at the same exact $499 price point, although sans some of the promises that Microsoft has given us. They've been pretty coy about backwards compatibility on software. Microsoft said if it didn't need a Kinect, it's going to work. And Sony is saying that there will be a select list of titles. Now, I've heard that increase to nearly 99%, but they're not really committing to anything. So we'll see how that actually plays out once the consoles launch, unfortunately. The other thing is that we are not getting a cut-down PlayStation 5 the same way Microsoft did things, where we have a Series S and a Series X. With the PlayStation 5, you have the PlayStation 5 and then you have the PlayStation 5 Digital Edition for $100 less at $399, which simply omits the disk drive. Now, there may be other changes that have not been publicly disclosed in the diskless version, but to date, that's what we know the difference is. And $100 for an optical drive seems a bit steep, but actually isn't terrible. And maybe there's some manufacturing costs that just go away there that I'm not considering, because from my point of view, an optical drive is maybe a $40 part. So part of the other side of this is that we've also heard that there's been a reduction in the number of PlayStation 5s being produced by about 4 million units from their target of 15 million by March 2021 to 11 million. I do wonder how much of this is a yield issue and how much might be that they weren't planning to actually ship them yet, and they've had to rush and change focus from just producing units to have sitting in a warehouse to getting ready to send them out before, well, this month when you can buy an Xbox Series X. So that'll all be interesting to see play out. I'll be keeping an eye on that. I don't really have a horse in this race one way or the other. I'm a PC guy, so for me, the exciting part in these new consoles is seeing what bits and pieces allow for better console ports to PC and maybe filter to a better gaming experience overall, not necessarily with any actual interest in purchasing one or the other. Although that said, the $35 a month is tempting for the Series X, when I actually pay that for my phone last I looked. So it's a very tempting offer there on the device. In bigger news, something that is going to make things interesting, we've got a couple of acquisitions this week. The smaller of the two, Verizon, is seeking to acquire Tracfone. Doesn't make a whole ton of sense to me. Verizon has their own prepaid, and this seems like it may just be a subscriber grab, trying to purchase a smaller carrier. But they are trying to purchase Tracfone. I believe there's been statements where the majority of Tracfone users are on Verizon's network anyway. So maybe this is a way to just lower costs and increase revenue by bringing everybody under one blanket so that they don't have to sell the services to Tracfone, who then resells them. They can just cut out the middleman. I don't see any reasons why the regulators would block this, since Tracfone is just an NVMO, but it does still need regulatory approval, which, considering the current state of the FCC, I don't see being blocked anyway. The bigger acquisition is that Nvidia, who seems to be gobbling companies up and batting 1,000 this month, purchased ARM. That is simultaneously terrifying and exciting. For one, I very much would love to see an ARM SoC with an RTX 3080 derived Ampere core show up in phones. And we know that Nvidia has made ARM SoCs for a while. There's been the Tegra chips, and they're plenty powerful. We've seen them in Nvidia's Shield. We've seen them in the current Nintendo Switch, and potentially the next generation Switch as well. But Nvidia doesn't always have a habit of playing nicely with everyone else. And that's not just hardware people, that's software people, which is a big part of the ARM ecosystem. They have famously caused problems with Linux. They have burned their bridges with Apple, who owns an ARM license and uses it for their A-series chips. So this may make for some interesting results in the market. Probably not this year, since next year's designs are already ironed out, but the year after, when we really start to see Nvidia's influence on ARM. Now, that said, I feel like ARM was kind of sitting still where it was at SoftBank. SoftBank had purchased ARM, and actually invested a good chunk in Sprint and really not done a whole ton with it. It just seemed like it was doing exactly what it had been in the background. So this does have room to make some radical changes. Whether those are good or bad is yet to be determined. Whether those are good or bad is yet to be determined. With all that said, if we didn't comment on something that you saw in the news this week, please leave us a note in the comments below. And if there's something that we touched on that you'd like to see us expand on further, definitely let us know and we will do so. I would like to thank our patrons for helping make content like this possible. If you are interested in helping support Pocketables, there's a link in the description below. It also helps if you subscribe. I also want to thank Electrix for providing our opening and closing themes. Definitely has some interesting music. Please check him out. There'll be a link to his channel in the description, as well as a card at some point in one of the themes. With all of that said, thank you for watching.